Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, FG&D Committee, for this opportunity. Thanks to Jim Angrisano and Mark Smith for sharing thoughts as I prepared this lecture, and I want to thank actually many colleagues over many years who have helped to shape my thinking and supported me in the development of what I've been doing here. I'm going to speak to you tonight about the relationship, strangely, between wealth and our ability to survive into the 22nd century. As is becoming startlingly clear, we have lost sight of ecological truths. I want to suggest that across the college, we must foster our students and our own abilities with regard to love, lies, and loss. That is, we must help our students develop passion for, that is, love for, seeking ecological truths. Wisdom to dissect lies that form the foundation of our culture, and the compassion to feel unprecedented magnitudes of environmental loss. In short, we must help our students as they undertake the crucial work of developing a language for a radically alternative culture. In preparing this lecture, I learned that 4 of the first 10 liberal arts lectures at the College of Idaho were given and written by biologists. The last time, and the only other time, that a botanist at the College of Idaho delivered the liberal arts lecture was when Pat Packard, who happens to have been my predecessor here, spoke to the faculty in 1980. She argued that, quote, "An integrated liberal arts begins with the laws of physics on the one end and carries the principles through the various humanities on the other," end quote. Any of you here for that? You'll see in my lecture tonight that I'll agree with Dr. Packard in claiming that without understanding the basic principles of physics and related sciences, we will not fully realize our human condition. You'll also see that the year of the lecture, 1980, is a seminal year both in my life and the life of the nation at large. 1980 was the year when I started a career of teaching at liberal arts colleges. It was also the year when Ronald Reagan was elected 40th President of the United States, asserted Reaganomics, and offered a stark contrast to the cautions taken by Jimmy Carter in his analysis of environmental problems. Reagan, and for the following decades, the United States, possessed a blind optimism in economic growth rooted in the orthodox economic belief that self-regulating markets can solve all problems. Since 1980, in our attempt to pursue all the wealth that unregulated markets can generate, we have largely ignored the rising environmental problems that were coming to the public's attention even in the 1970s. Also, in about 1980, the songwriter and musician Bill Staines recorded a song that I later wrote into my son Ethan's baby book. The lyrics of the chorus to this song appear on this slide. "Son, listen to me, don't you go telling no lies. They'll get you in deep trouble, they'll follow you like flies. Son, watch where you're walking, don't be afraid to lose. Put some memories in your traveling bag and miles upon your shoes." When I first encountered this song, at about the time of Dr. Packard's liberal arts lecture, I thought the song offered sound advice: never lie, overcome fear, and explore. Over the ensuing 3 decades, however, these words have taken on new meaning to me. The transformations in the Earth's atmosphere, oceans, estuaries, rivers, wetlands, forests, agricultural lands, grasslands, and shrub steppe that have occurred during my adult life leave me both bewildered and fearful. And I am not without blame for these transformations. How can I tell my children never to lie when I am living one? How can I tell them not to fear loss when I'm terribly afraid? And how can I encourage the personal growth that results from travel without feeling horribly conflicted about my own energy footprint? How can we all continue business as usual in the face of the most calamitous environmental crisis the planet has experienced in 65 million years. Whether we believe it or not, we are all dependent upon a living planet with an evolutionary history, interdependent upon a multitude of other creatures with whom we share this planet. Shockingly to me, however, fewer and fewer individuals truly understand our dependencies on the rest of nature. As natural landscapes have become more modified, indeed more than half of the land surface of the planet has been modified by human activities, it is harder to find our innate connections to natural processes and natural ecosystems. The appearance of a new housing development or shopping mall in your life may seem different or even disturbing because you knew the landscape that it replaced. But your children and any newcomers will always remember the mall as the way it was. Some theorists refer to this phenomenon as creeping normalcy. Creeping normalcy occurs as we gradually accept as normal an altered condition. It becomes so commonplace that we forget what preceded it. As a result of creeping normalcy, an urban dweller has increasing difficulty remembering that food comes from a farm, water from an aquifer, and a t-shirt from a cotton field. As Robert Michael Pyle writes, we can learn about natural processes in relatively urban landscapes, an irrigation ditch or a vacant lot, but more and more people are deprived even of that. There are emotional and physical challenges that result from not experiencing engagement with the natural world. For example, nature deficit disorder, obesity, and general ignorance of life processes. Studies also link self-esteem and creativity to attentive time spent in the outdoors. As human ignorance and isolation from natural processes become more widespread, we face increasing difficulty. First, in generating wonder about the natural world, and second, in understanding how dependent we are on resilient natural systems. So tonight, I want to dwell on love, lies, and loss. While I'll develop a discussion of each of these, here briefly is what I mean by each of the terms. The first, love. Natural landscapes and their biotic diversity can be a source of human wonder. The love of which I speak here is not eros, the romantic love of beauty, or philia, the love between friends, but agape, sacrificial love. Agape is the love that motivates us to protect and to steward. Agape, in the words of theologian Susan Bratton, tempers our use of nature so that, quote, insatiable desire doesn't attempt to extract more from creation than it can sustain, end quote. Second, the lies. Our obsession with economic growth and accumulation of wealth, which has accelerated over the past 35 years, has blinded us to truths, ecological truths. If we do not come to understand and account for those truths, we risk compromising the integrity of our life support systems. That is, we risk environmental collapse. Third, the loss. Present-day loss of biological species diversity is of such magnitude that it is already termed the sixth extinction, and our human impact is so far-reaching globally that many deem it a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene. Our increase in fossil fuel-based energy consumption is exacerbating biodiversity and habitat loss to such a degree that it has been called by some a crime against humanity. We must liberate ourselves from ignorance of natural processes and accept the lie that forms the basis of our culture if we have any hope of stemming the tide of collapse. The role of the liberal arts, education that liberates us from bonds of ignorance, will be increasingly urgent and challenging. I'll now give more thorough attention to each of my main themes, love, lies, and loss, before offering some concluding thoughts on the liberal arts in relation to these themes. Love. Since I was a child, I have thrived on exploration. In my teen years, my family lived in Pittsburgh, where I recall exploring the woods behind my house. I followed trails until they led me to new developments. And after I had all the paths mapped out in my head, I forged new trails into unknown territory. I couldn't get enough of exploration. Each summer, when my family vacationed in Rocky Mountain National Park, I spent every day following creeks from beaver pond to beaver pond. As I got to high school and we lived in Seattle, I followed Cascade Range ridgelines in search of the next drainage or a distant peak. In college, I spent my summers fishing for salmon in Alaska with my Native American friend, my Alutiiq friend, Jerry, an experienced fisherman. When not fishing, I explored the ridges and coastlines of Kodiak Island. I was fascinated by everything from the conflict of cultures in the nearby villages where the canneries were located, to the manner in which the bears created trails, as shown in the upper right here, by always stepping in the same spots, forming dotted trails rather than continuous paths. We lived in tents on a small island in Uyak Bay, a mile swim, for the bears, from the nearest bear-inhabited shores. I cooked the meals for our crew of 3 and wondered about the edibility of our local flora. During the school year, I attended a small liberal arts college where I became inspired to wonder in new ways about new ideas. I was so in love with learning, I tried several majors. I started as a physics major out of curiosity for the forces that build mountains and passion for the beauty of mathematics. Soon, however, I was exposed to British literature and briefly thought I was suited as an English major. I took my first biology course as a sophomore, but it wasn't until my junior year that I realized I'd better settle on a major. It wasn't until my senior year that I began exploring the world of flowers. I followed my passion for exploring mountains and my newfound passion for plant biology by pursuing graduate work and more backcountry travel at the University of British Columbia. In my doctoral and postdoctoral studies, and later as I began teaching, I shared my explorations with my students. We studied lakeshore colonization and eventually started describing new species and wondering about the evolution of plants here in southwestern Idaho and southeastern Oregon. It seems almost trivial for me to claim to be in awe of the beauty of nature and the wonder of the natural world. Yet in my short stay as an adult, I have been fortunate to witness much natural diversity and abundant evidence of the rich and intricate patterns of our evolutionary history. As a biologist in love with biological diversity, I have witnessed the biotic changes of the past 35 years. Lies. We live a lie. The lie we live is believing that our culture of consumption and unconstrained economic growth is sustainable. As Vermont ecologist Tom Wessels put it in his book Myth of Progress, at some point, economic expansion will outstrip both the availability of resources and the ability of the earth to absorb the waste products generated by this growth, end quote. The assumptions of mainstream neoclassical economic thinking have brought us to the verge of ecological collapse because our current economic system does not abide by ecological principles. The troubles emerge from overuse of energy, a lack of consideration of limits, unconstrained growth, and ineffective valuation of our ecological dependencies. As Øystein Dahle, former vice president of Exxon Europe, stated, socialism collapsed because it didn't allow the market to tell the economic truth. Capitalism may collapse because it does not allow the market to tell the ecological truth. Here are some of the ecological truths that our lie ignores. We must recognize that the fundamental assumptions of our current economic system lack grounding in physical and ecological principles. There are at least 2 flaws. First, we assume that there are no limits. Second, we do not yet know how to pay for the true cost of goods. On the first assumption, physicist Joe Romm likens our use of non-renewable resources to a Ponzi scheme. We all probably experienced chain letters as kids. You pay me $1, and then just ask each of 10 people to pay you $1, assuring each that they too will grow rich, just like you, the same way. You make out like a bandit. Perhaps this could work if the world had an unlimited supply of gullible idiots. But we all know that financial Ponzi schemes that pay investors by sole reliance on continued growth of new investors lead to one outcome: collapse. So too with our reliance on non-renewable resources. Our thirst for fossil fuels provides an example. If we despoil an area like the Athabascan tar sands, displacing the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation, we can just move to another region, like the sacred headwaters of the Stikine and Skeena rivers in northern British Columbia, home of the Tahltan First Nation, or to Yasuni National Park in the Amazon of eastern Ecuador, home of the Tegeri and Tarominane. This ecological Ponzi scheme assumes an unlimited supply of developing nations with cheap labor and undervalued natural resources. Of course, there are many who find this lie quite comfortable. As long as globalized corporations can move from country to country, extracting materials and availing themselves of cheap labor pools, developing nations can continue to have their inexpensive products. The costs are either borne by the impoverished people of the developing nation, with a promise that they too can become wealthy like us, or the costs are deferred to future generations who will have to deal with the consequences of pollution, atmospheric CO2, and collapse of local economies. When the victims of the Ponzi schemes are individual humans, there is a legal system to bring justice to the perpetrators. When the victims are ecological systems, attributing costs to bring about justice becomes abstract at best. The lack of understanding of limits to growth is further borne out in the metrics that we use to measure our standard of living or economic progress. One can't go a day without being barraged by the metric GDP, gross domestic product. We strive to grow this metric at all costs. But this metric places the same value on money spent to develop more fuel-efficient cars, public transportation systems, or durable furniture, as it does on dollars spent to fight crime, drug addiction, and terrorism, or to clean up oil spills, or clean up Superfund sites, or on medical costs to combat obesity, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, emphysema, asthma, and many cancers, all of which are tied to a deteriorating environment. Alternative metrics of economic progress exist, such as Sustainable Economic Welfare, Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, or Genuine Progress Index, GPI. The latter, the GPI, adjusts for costs associated with environmental degradation. In fact, between 1950 and 1980, both GDP and GPI rose, but as environmental degradation accelerated in the past 35 years, GPI has continued to drop. Yet GDP marches on, promising more jobs, greater wealth for all, and supposedly a better quality of life, reinforcing the fallacious assumption of no limits. A second neglected ecological truth centers on what economist Herman Daly calls the externalities, or environmental costs not reflected in the prices of what we consume. The means by which we generate wealth result in great costs to both the environment and to native communities, but we don't pay for or even recognize generally this truth. The mess that is left behind following such ventures as mountaintop coal removal or tar sands oil extraction and the hundreds of other similar energy development projects is multi-layered. Native biotic communities suffer, rivers and wetlands suffer, excess pollutants compromise the integrity of natural and human systems, just go to China, and native human communities are displaced. And the costs that are borne by the local biotic and human communities, or by the general global public, not by the consumers of the products, and not by the investors who derive the wealth from those extractions. The wealth generated becomes concentrated in the hands of a few, and the costs are borne by the many, including the native ecosystems that rely on soil health, high water quality, high air quality, and intact functioning biotic communities. So we pursue wealth and accumulation of material goods at the expense of our natural environment without much real improvement in our standard of living. The most pernicious indicator of these lies is our modification of our planet's climate system, which is becoming more apparent all the time. By 1980, the year of Dr. Packard's liberal arts lecture, it was quite clear that the most likely explanation for a consistent rise in global carbon dioxide levels was a global increase in fossil fuel consumption and deforestation. So at that time, what we now refer to as global climate change was both predicted and supported by the data. This prediction was ignored by largely everyone outside the scientific community for more than 2 decades. Now, 3 decades later, it is clear to all but a vocal few, largely those in the pockets of industries or lifestyles which stand to lose by acknowledging this reality, that not only are anthropogenic greenhouse gases still on the rise, but also the climate change that was predicted to result from the rise is now well underway. The black curve in this slide shows the steady increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. And the ends of the colored bars show annual global temperature. The blue bars, representing those in years below the 120-year average, and those red bars in years above that average. The Nobel Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, stated in 2007 that, quote, warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and that the observed increase since the mid-20th century is due to increases in anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. It is important to understand that the IPCC consists of scientists from 130 countries. Each of those 130 countries has veto power over the language of the conclusions of the final draft of the document. That is, the conclusions of the IPCC, though reflecting consensus, are highly conservative. Here are some examples of that conservative expression of our global climate status from the most recent 2013 report. Quote, for average annual Northern Hemisphere temperatures, the period between 1983 and 2012 was very likely the warmest 30-year period in the last 800 years, and likely the warmest 30-year period of the last 1,400 years. And, quote, it is virtually certain that the upper ocean has warmed between 1971 and 2010. And it is very likely that the mean rate of sea level rise was 1.7 millimeters per year between 1901 and 2010, and between 1993 and 2010, the rate was very likely higher at 3.2 millimeters per year. To translate, 3 millimeters per year or 30 centimeters per century, the rate at which sea level rise in the past 20 years is about a foot per century. That is, sea level is now rising at a rate of at least a foot per century. The slide I am projecting is from the 2001 IPCC report. When the IPCC makes its predictions, it does so for 4 sets of assumptions. The best case scenario, the lower numbers, like 9 centimeters here, predicted sea level on the graph, are for immediate reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. The higher numbers are for the business as usual scenario. That is, what happens if we don't implement any changes to reduce the rate at which we're generating greenhouse gas emissions. The added numbers on the right of this graph are from the 2013 IPCC report. Note that in the decade between reports, that is, the first decade of the 21st century, the high end of predictions is not changing much because we have been conducting business as usual. The lower numbers are higher because we have lost a decade in which to take more decisive actions. To end this trend will require that we no longer conduct business as usual. Yet the abundance of cheap fossil fuels is at the core of everything we do. The growth of material wealth is fueled by energy, and oil, natural gas, and coal account for 85% of our global energy production. Even if we were to cease consumption of fossil fuels today, however, we would not reverse the condition, we would just stop it from deteriorating further. Ameliorating climate change will require multiple solutions throughout the world, including population stabilization, reduction in per capita energy consumption, and transition to alternative energy sources. The lies have gotten out of control. Loss. Of the many losses associated with unrestrained economic growth, I'll discuss just three, all of which are aggravated by climate change. The loss to human societies, the loss to biological diversity, and concomitant ecosystem simplification, and the loss to marine fisheries. The loss to human societies. If we cannot kick our addiction to fossil fuels quickly, the human cost in form of increased numbers of ecological refugees from sea level rise alone will be globally calamitous. In India and Bangladesh, hundreds of thousands have already been displaced by flooding directly associated with sea level rise. To put climate change refugees into perspective, consider the current refugee situation in the 5 most critical areas of the world today: Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, and Sudan, where there were 8 million refugees in 2012, resulting from conflict, political persecution, and general violence. Compare that, 8 million, to what London-based Environmental Justice Foundation Global Trends reports as the number of people worldwide who have already had to move due to the effects of climate change, 26 million, a figure that is estimated to grow to 150 million by 2050. The cost to biological species diversity and concomitant ecosystem simplification. In a Sand County Almanac, Aldo Leopold wrote, quote, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise," end quote. To many, the beauty of natural functional ecosystems alone is reason to respect it and protect it. But to sustain a growing, huge human population, we must grow food, extract minerals, extract energy, harvest wood, and remove fish from the sea. How do we do this and maintain ecological systems with functional integrity? Sometimes we succeed, and practices then are sustainable. When maintenance of stability and integrity of ecosystems are prioritized in those processes, ecosystems can continue to provide what environmental scientists call ecosystem services. Ecosystem services include such functions as maintaining soil health, recycling wastes, storing and purifying water, acting as sponges to prevent floods, keeping pest and pathogen populations in check, maintaining viable populations of pollinators, which are necessary for much of our food production, removing harmful toxins, and a whole host of other life support functions that the natural world critically provides to humanity free of charge. One attempt to assign dollar value to those ecosystem services worldwide estimates these free services at $33 trillion per year, 30% more than the global GNP in that same time period. It behooves us to preserve the health of biotic communities to preserve our own health. A fundamental lesson of ecology borne out in studies of ecosystems worldwide is that the greater the complexity in an ecosystem, the greater resistance the system has to perturbation. That is, the more native, evolved biotic diversity a system has, the more likely it will continue to function after a disturbance. In times of stress, an overly simplified ecosystem with few species may experience a cascade of devastating ripple effects if a single species is lost. With more diverse and complex systems, a similar single species loss may hardly be felt because there is redundancy and overlap in the ecological roles that species play. with more diverse and complex systems, a similar single-species loss may be hardly felt because there's redundancy and overlap in the ecological roles that species play, thus allowing the more diverse ecosystem to be more resilient. So one way to measure naturalness in a system, and by inference, integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, is by measuring the proportion of native species that remain after an ecosystem has been modified. As native species are lost from an area, so too are a fraction of the ecosystem services of that area. Though we do not always fully understand or appreciate the extent to which we lose functions, incremental loss matters. And it matters more so in more simplified ecosystems. Paul Ehrlich suggested an analogy in the 1960s between native species in an ecosystem and an airliner. Many rivets hold an airplane together, and there's much redundancy in the design, so if a few rivets are lost, the airplane stays aloft. But at some point, if enough rivets are removed, the plane fails, and a crash is inevitable. So too with native ecosystems, and so too with the ecosystem services that they provide us. The loss of enough species will lead to ecosystem collapse. Biodiversity loss, that is, species loss, is occurring at unprecedented rates. The rate at which extinctions are occurring in the past couple of centuries or so rivals the rates of the 5 great mass extinctions known from the past 450 million years. Paleontologists refer to our current mass extinction as the 6th extinction, the 5th being the one 65 million years ago when dinosaurs perished. Though it is difficult to estimate extinction rates with precision, most estimates suggest that we are losing species at about 1,000 times the normal rate of loss through most geological time. That is what scientists call background extinction rate, 1,000 times background extinction. In the past century, species extinctions have resulted primarily from habitat loss, invasive species introductions, pollution, human overpopulation, overhunting, and overfishing. A sizable portion of animal and plant species are currently threatened by extinction. Those species that are vulnerable, imperiled, or critically imperiled range from 15 to 70% of all species, depending on the group, such as freshwater mussels at the top of the chart here, or birds at the bottom. And as you see in this slide, by the red circle, aquatic groups of creatures are those most threatened, largely because we have most adversely affected our streams, rivers, and wetlands more than our terrestrial systems. In coming years, expect to hear more examples of conflicts between species on the brink of extinction and demands for more resources by a growing human population, hungry for energy, food, or water. You may already have heard of the Delta smelt. In Idaho, we are fortunate. For example, only 12% of our plant species are in the vulnerable to critically imperiled range. We have a small human population in our geographical area. We seem to have much untrammeled native forest. But please don't feel complacent. Within the past decade, largely by chance, vigilant citizens discovered in what appeared to be pristine forest in Boise National Forest arsenic seeping from a test mine into the Boise River, at hundreds of times the level deemed safe for human or ecosystem health. Threats like this will always be on the horizon. But yes, relative to the rest of the world, we are very fortunate. Still, we bear witness in Canyon County to this loss of biodiversity. When agriculture and ranching boomed in the late 19th to early 20th century here in Caldwell, the founder of the College of Idaho and college's first botanist, William Judson Boone, often took his students to the Boise River to study natural history. Reflecting back to these excursions made by Dr. Boone and his students, the college's second botanist, Boone's student, Harold M. Tucker, said around 1950, quote, "Scarcely had Dr. Boone begun to feel as though he knew the local plants when grazing began to cause the disappearance of many forms. We had gone to Curtis Park by the Boise River for plants, only to find, to our disappointment, that the place had been turned into a sheep pasture. As Dr. Boone stood where for 35 years he had been able to gather certain plants, now gone forever, he expressed himself this way: 'Well, Civilization is a great thing, but it's awfully hard on a naturalist. That same Curtis Park in the foreground of the slide was the site of a survey conducted in 2002 by a College of Idaho student, Chad Davis. In 2002, 43% of the 122 plant species in the area were exotics. That is, introduced from elsewhere, mostly Eurasia. In a survey within the last decade of another nearby park-like area, Deer Flat National Wildlife Refuge, the area around Lake Lowell, 7 miles south of Caldwell, we found 57% of 129 plant species were exotics. Even areas that appear to be natural areas are quite highly modified. The extent to which functionality of these two sites is compromised is unstudied. During her senior honors investigations of slickspot peppergrass, an endangered species endemic to the Treasure Valley, student Laura Barber realized that this rare species is actually 3 species, one of which had been documented by Dr. Boone and his students, but has not been seen since 1950. It likely became extinct with the development of agriculture in the valley, but botanists have not even recognized it or named it to even document its demise. We need not go far to find incremental loss of native species and homogenization of habitats with incoming invasive species. Why lament the loss of native species? Because those are the ones that evolved on the site over the long course of time to fit together into a functional whole that provides the ecosystem services that I described above. Species extinctions have accelerated as a consequence of climate change. For example, between 1993 and 2003, surveys of reptiles in Madagascar showed that the ranges of many species had moved uphill by 65 meters, or about 200 feet. For some, that meant extinction, as these animals met the tops of the hills and had nowhere else to move up. For others, it is clearly only a matter of time. Perhaps the best documented example of a species loss attributable already to climate change is the golden toad of the Monteverde cloud forest in Costa Rica. College of Idaho students were fortunate on our trip to Costa Rica in 2000 to meet with Alan Pounds and hear the fascinating science behind his unraveling of the story of the golden toad extinction. As ocean temperatures rise, so too does the level of clouds along the high ridge separating the Atlantic and Pacific sides of Costa Rica. In short, the cloud forest upon which the golden toad depended has moved up so it's no longer cloudy long enough on the highest ridges for the toads to survive. By 1989, the animals so abundant a decade earlier had become extinct. Closer to home, in the 1990s, students and I found populations of a rare plant species in wet meadows at the highest elevations on Steens Mountain in southeastern Oregon, which may already have, we found populations of rare species which may already have become locally extinct in the past 20 years, as no one has seen them since when we saw them in the 90s. There are indeed many species of plants at the top of Steens Mountain which are known to occur in small populations, and just 1 or 2 populations, which may perish as climate warms and there is no higher hill nearby to ascend to keep them within the range of temperature and moisture that can sustain them. It may be possible for some species to adapt to climate change if they can migrate north in the northern hemisphere fast enough to simply move their ranges. Rates of range shifts required to keep pace with predicted warming are on the order of several kilometers per year. That's a very rapid migration for plant or animal species to keep pace with, even when habitat is available through which to migrate. But anthropogenically fragmented habitats now exist over most of the Earth's surface, which will prevent migrations of many, if not most, of those species. Loss to marine fisheries. In 1980, the limits of ocean productivity seemed unfathomable and far in the future. But studies in the early part of the 21st century demonstrated limits to even ocean fisheries. 60% of marine fisheries are either fully exploited, overexploited, or depleted. misguided policy, lack of enforcement of fishing regulations, and consumer demand have resulted in the calamitous decline of fish stocks in our oceans. And this reduction of large predators, like the bluefin tuna, that fish may sell for $1.3 million. Like bluefin tuna, means an increase in smaller species lower on the food chain and a disruption and simplification of ecosystems. As a result of removal of cod off the coast of Newfoundland, we see a growing lobster fishery. As a result of removal of large predators in many areas, shrimp and prawn fisheries are booming. Consumers don't realize that these fisheries are booming as a consequence of ecological degradation, not because of health of natural systems. In a world where 75% of the global human population depends on seafood for its source of protein, what happens when those smaller, lower-level species are overfished? The predictions are that species such as jellyfish and worms and the like may be atop the food chain of such simplified ecosystems, in a manner that cheatgrass monoculture has come to predominate modified sagebrush ecosystems in some of southwestern Idaho. The ecological costs of loss of both biological diversity and ecosystem complexity that I have discussed here are serious. The losses have accelerated as a consequence of climate change, and climate change, according to evolutionary biologist Amy Seidel, is, quote, no longer just a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. It is a crime against humanity, and we need to articulate and come up with a language for that crime. The liberal arts. It's the tradition of the liberal arts to liberate us from the bonds of ignorance. The task of 21st century liberal arts education is to articulate a language to expose a fundamental lie embedded in our culture, a lie that perpetuates a crime against humanity. So how should we proceed? I would argue that the most important beginning is to ensure that children spend as much time as possible in nature. It is there that love for the world develops, that is, agape. Without that primal connection to life around us through love, there is no motivation to care for the world, to steward it, or to protect it. And for children to spend that time outdoors in gardens, forests, streams, their parents, teachers, and influential adults must do the same. An education that provides opportunities for students to explore and wonder in the natural world is critical to our survival. We must help students develop a love for seeking ecological truths. We must also help students develop the wisdom to dissect lies, to lead in developing an economy that values what we currently discount, that is, ecological services, among other things, and to count what we value. By this I mean that we must teach economics as a subset of ecology, not a process devoid of ecological considerations. The same could be said of policy and psychology, among others. We must help students to see ecological Ponzi schemes and unconstrained growth as unsustainable paths. We need to cultivate in our students development of revised and deepened notions of citizenship and the nurturing of capacious levels of compassion. Such an education simply cannot be experienced online. This kind of liberal arts education must lead to profound cultural change. We might look to history to guide us. When, if ever, in our history did we experience another crime against humanity? Destructive practices so entrenched and embedded in all aspects of society that they permeated the very fabrics of our landscape and culture. As historian Charles Mann points out, the widespread practice of slavery provides such an example, and that practice eventually ended in the United States. While it endured, however, everything about this nation was infused with slavery. All that we ate, drank, and wore was implicated in the practice of slavery. The lie of early America was that the nation practiced what it preached about freedom, liberty, and justice for all. Not unlike the environmentalist movement today, the abolitionist movement was first seen as radical. It was factious. There were many arguments and much accusation, and there was much violence even before the Civil War. There was much ink and blood shed before there was profound cultural change. What was at first thought to be a social movement became the basis for a radically new normal, with profound implications for politics, landscapes, and all Americans, arguably all citizens of the world. Environmentalism, if by that term we mean a commitment to reducing resource consumption and seeking truly sustainable institutions, is neither a social movement nor an ideology. It's neither a fad nor a luxury. It's an essential part of civic responsibility. To accept the assumptions of consumerist culture, however blindly, is not inaction. Rather, it is irresponsible action. Neither was abolitionism an ideology. It was about what it means to be human, just as environmentalism today is about what it means to be human in a world threatened with environmental collapse. Finally, I want to refer to David Sobel's book, Place-Based Education, to give us some ideas of how we might begin to help students develop passion for seeking ecological truths, wisdom to dissect lies, and the compassion to feel unprecedented magnitudes of environmental loss. Sobel argues that we should blend community, school, and environment. A precedent for our having done this lies in the now defunct Snake River Regional Studies Center, a community outreach, research-based institute that arguably marked the apex of the College of Idaho's contribution to the world. Engaging students in projects which promote change in the community empowers them with combined skills of meaningful problem solving and civic responsibility. I started this talk by mentioning some lyrics that I wrote in my son's baby book with the intention of giving him some advice. My father's advice to me, however, was always, leave things better than the way you found them. I'm a few short years away from retirement, and I'm fearful that I can't leave this place better than I found it. But the least I can do is to encourage you, all of you, and our students to do so. That's what I had hoped to do here tonight. And now, it's time for me to take my 6-year-old girl outside to revel in spring. I encourage you all to do something similar. We need to bear witness to our staggering world. It is as beautiful and diverse now as it ever will be. Thank you for listening.